Hello? Oh, yeah. Okay. Very pleased to have Dr. Crystal Park here with us, Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Connecticut. And Dr. Park spent a great deal of her career studying the psychology of religion, spirituality, particularly as it relates to health and my understanding to cancer survivors. And also dealing with meaning in the context of stressful life events. And my own personal reading of her work, I think one of her great contributions has been to provide an empirical basis for a lot of the things we talk about in the literature, particularly some of these more abstract theoretical papers and stuff. And Dr. Park has been able to operationalize them and provide some detail into some of the theory, and thus provide us all with a more nuanced understanding of this construct of meaning. So with that, turn it over to Dr. Park.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I am very honored to be here today to speak with you, and actually to have been invited to this conference. It's really an honor, and I was here in 2000 at the first gathering, and it's amazing and really delightful to see how it's grown and sustained this energy. It just feels really good to be with a group of nice people who are really committed to studying and understanding and applying issues of meaning. It's so central, and it's an easily overlooked construct today while everybody is pursuing ever more scientific fMRI type studies or genetics, and the bigger thing about, geez, why are we here, what are we doing, gets kind of ignored. So it's really, really nice to be with a group who values that area of inquiry. So thank you for the nice introduction. What I would like to do today is to talk about this question. How does meaning relate to recovery following trauma? And that's really kind of where I want to, just the question that hopefully when you leave you will have some sense of that, that you don't have now. And I'm going to do that by talking through a model that I have been working on for a long time, the meaning-making model of coping. So I'm really talking about meaning as it applies to trauma, to a specific situation. In that introduction, I think that was very helpful in summing up what I've been trying to do, which is trying to take some of these abstract constructs and talk about them in a way that allows us to operationalize, to study, to talk to each other. And the meaning summit that Paul's organized, that he had part one today, I think is along those same lines of trying to get us in a place where even if we're pursuing different things and in different ways, that we're using some of the same language so that we can kind of cross-pollinate and really advance the science of meaning. Not everybody even believes that you can operationalize it or capture it, but I kind of lean on the side of thinking that is possible to do. So meaning is central to human life, and I think people would, I'm getting a lot of feedback, I don't know, but anyway, I'm hearing that. Meaning is a very big, abstract, broad, difficult concept to nail down, and one of the things that I've done to try to help people to understand and talk to each other about meaning is to divide it into two parts. One is called global meaning, and one is called situational meaning. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these, and then most of the talk is really focused on that situational meaning because we're talking about a specific situation, which is trauma. Okay, but when we go to what global meaning is, we're really focusing on that. There are three parts to global meaning as I've been able to discern in the literature. And that is beliefs, goals, and values, and a subjective sense of meaning. So those three components together comprise global meaning. So beliefs, global beliefs are this set, and I'll just pull them out here, of beliefs that people have that they may not be aware of them. They're kind of the fundamental worldviews or assumptions that people carry around with them, and they include things like fairness or justice, how fair the world is it a just world, their identity, their sense of who they are, a sense of control, do they control things, are things controllable at all, do other people control things, predictability, coherence of the world, does it make sense, are people in the world benevolent, are they unpredictable? Who knows? Personal vulnerability, that is, how vulnerable am I to having something bad happen to me? And then spirituality or religiousness. And, you know, another area of research that I do and do quite a bit of is on religion and spirituality. And so that's a different talk than the one I'm giving today. But religion or spirituality just keeps coming up. When you study meaning and when you study trauma, you hear a lot about religion and spirituality. And so in another context, I might argue that religion or spirituality for many people actually underlies or infuses a lot of these other beliefs, like control or fairness, et cetera, et cetera. But for today, I'll just leave that as a separate little belief set. Okay, so goals and values, second part of that global meaning system. Goals are what we hold most important in life and what we work toward being or achieving or maintaining. And it's really important that people think about goals more broadly than just things that we don't have that we're working towards. It's kind of unfortunate because the goal folks have talked about goals not just as things that we're working towards, but as things that we have that we want to keep. And so that's a really important part of our goals system. And you may not realize that those are your goals until they are threatened or taken away from you, your health or a relationship, and then suddenly you realize how important it was for you to have kept that. So Eric Klinger was one of the early people who talked about goals that way, and I think that that's a really important part. So it's not just striving towards something in the future, but keeping what we have. Common goals that people report are things like relationships, religion, work, health, wealth, knowledge, and achievement. Values are the ways in which we select and pursue those goals. And the indicators, the ways that people study goals, in addition to asking them what their goals are, is asking how much time, effort, energy, resources, or money people spend in pursuit of those things that are really important to them. And a whole different line of research I won't go into today talks about discrepancies between what people say is important to them and what they actually end up doing with their time and their money and their attention. But obviously, to the extent that those things are aligned, the better off someone's going to be. Okay, and then that third part, and this came up a little bit in the Meaning Summit today, is this issue of a subjective sense. What is that part of our global meaning that is subjective, that's just like, yeah, I feel like my life's meaningful. And this is what I think of as meaningfulness, the sense of meaning or purpose in life that's often measured when people are asked questions like, do you feel your life is meaningful? Do you have goals or purposes that are important to you and you're working towards? So that is, the flavor of that is subjective. No one else can answer that for you. And so to that extent, I think that it is the subjective component. So that subjective sense of meaning is the third part of what I would call the global meaning. Okay, so for this talk, what I really want to focus on is trauma. So I'm really going to focus on the second part of meaning, which is situational meaning. And situational meaning has 4 parts, okay? So there is that sort of appraisal of a specific stressful event. And I'm gonna go through all these sort of steps so you'll see them, but just to give you a preview. The appraisals, so people appraise an event that occurs, and then they compare that appraisal that they have with their global meaning system. To the extent that those things are congruent, a person is not distressed. To the extent that there is discrepancy, there is distress, and people try to make meaning to alleviate that, to restore the congruence. And then there are these outcomes, these changes in meaning that I call products of those efforts. Okay, so I will go through those. I know that was a quick pass through, but I want to talk about them particularly in the context of applying this model to trauma and traumatic events. What I want to point out is that this is a circular process. This is a reciprocal, ongoing process that is happening all the time to highlight that it's not just a one-time event. Now, traumas, hopefully in your life, you'll have one or none. On average, people have at least one. But we have highly stressful events. We have pretty stressful events. We have events of modest magnitude happening to us all the time. Actually, that was brought up this morning in the summit, is that life is stressful, life is hard, and so you could enter this this circle at any point. Since global meaning is up there at the top, that's where I'll start. So people have, before a trauma occurs or a stressful event, we've got a global meaning system in place, and that trauma occurs, and people assign some meaning to that. They try to make meaning from it. Their meanings may change as a result of that, and then that would perhaps change the global meaning system so that the next time a person encounters trauma, they will be different. Okay, so for example, you may, through a result of meaning making, come to believe that there is no God, or that you have no control over what happens to you. And that will be the meaning that is in place in a subsequent stressful encounter. So it's just a reciprocal sort of ongoing model. People have high levels of trauma, as I said. Most people experience at least one traumatic event, and of those, about 10 to 20% of people will develop PTSD. Many other people will have subclinical PTSD symptoms. But what's really interesting is that trauma, like everything else that seems at this conference, depends on the definition, right? So DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, has sort of a list of these are the things that are traumas. And certain things are traumas and certain things are officially not traumas. They don't meet the technical definition. But research that looks at the issue of what do people really find traumatic or stressful show that it's not so much what's on that official list, but the meanings that people assign to it. And often things that are not technically traumas are more troublesome and create PTSD for people, PTSD symptoms, more so than the official traumas. So when we're thinking about trauma, and as I'm talking about it here, I'm going to talk, for example, about cancer survivorship. And a cancer diagnosis is not necessarily meeting criteria for trauma according to psychiatrists, but it is something that many people experience as pretty damn traumatic. So in thinking about what's trauma, and Bob yesterday was talking about traumatic grief and people who were bereaved because of a violent, really terrific, horrific kind of episode. But many other people experience bereavements that are more normal, life normative, or natural, and still find them pretty distressing or traumatic. So trauma can be pretty broadly defined. And towards that end, I'm going to talk about 3 groups to sort of illustrate and use some of the quotes from the research to highlight some of these points. And we have samples of traumatized college students, and these are students who were screened in our participant pool at the University of Connecticut for DSM level trauma. So those are people who did meet the criteria for an official trauma. Bereaved college students, and these are people who reported having a significant loss within the past year. And cancer survivors, there were 250 cancer survivors in a sample that we studied that were diagnosed within the past 2 years of a variety of cancers. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that that first group, the students who had had a true trauma sometime in their life up to the point at which we got them, which was at about age 19, it's pretty young, they were in a study where we were looking at meaning making of trauma. So we had, if you're familiar with James Pennebaker's expressive writing paradigm, we had one group doing the expressive writing, writing about their deepest thoughts and feelings about their trauma. We had one group as a control group talking about what they did on a daily basis, and then we had a meaning-making condition. We were trying to accelerate meaning-making by having people write about some of the discrepancies and ways to resolve them and grow from them. So their narratives are actually the ones that illustrate some of the meaning-making processes because that's what we were studying. Okay, so when you think about that first part of situational meaning, the appraised meaning, what you're talking about here is the meaning assigned to that specific event. It's very idiosyncratic, and it's going to be based on what you're experiencing, previous experiences, like you may have had cancer before or someone close to you has, or what you've heard about cancer in the media, the immediate information that you're hearing from your doctor, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also based on your understanding of why you. Okay, why did you get cancer? Maybe it's because you smoked or you were around toxic chemicals or et cetera, et cetera. But the thing, and Paul alluded to this a little bit this morning, was that people make different types of attribution. So even though you have that proximal attribution, I got cancer because I smoked, we know that not everybody who smokes gets cancer. We know that not everybody who gets cancer smokes. So there's still that bigger question, that more distal question of why did I get cancer? Why me? The extent of threat, loss, or challenge, if you're familiar with Lazarus and Folkman's work, they talk about primary appraisal. So when you first encounter a stressor, you determine the extent to which it is a threat, meaning some really bad things can come from this, some harm can come from this. Or as a challenge, meaning perhaps you can overcome this, perhaps you can fight this, and a loss, which it means that damage has already been sustained and you've just got to sort of deal with the aftermath. So usually when you're talking about trauma, it's less so a challenge, more of a threat or a loss. But all three of those kinds of appraisals can be part of it. The ability to respond, so your sense of your capacity to cope with this trauma and the implications that it has for your life. So with a cancer diagnosis, you get that word, you might be thinking, oh my God, am I going to die? What's going to happen to my family? Am I going to be able to keep working? What kinds of treatment am I going to have to go through? So right at that point, lots of things going through your head that are going to determine the meaning of that situation right there. Now what happens is this is going to change, okay? Through the course of cancer, as you get more information, as you start going through treatment and learn the specifics of what's going on, these things change. So when you're talking about this appraised meaning, here I'm really talking about it at the point at which you first get that appraisal. But that lasts for about 1 second, right? Because pretty soon you start getting more thoughts and more information. And so appraised meaning changes all the time. And it's going to continue to change. And it's almost impossible to study it. I mean, how could you really do this? Really study the initial meaning someone had. So you're always doing retrospective studies if you're trying to get back to that point when you first heard that this person had died, or when you first got cancer, or when you were assaulted, how did it feel? And it's going to be really hard for people to recall. Okay, and then the next part of this model, the appraised meaning vis-a-vis global meaning, this is a discrepancy-based model, and we're really focusing here on violations, meaning that your understanding of what happened to you, your trauma, is discrepant or violates your global meaning. That's really, really critical. People have a very hard time with violations, and even from very simple experiences that we have when something just doesn't feel right, it's like that's inconsistent with how you understand things or what you wanted, is distressing. And so that discrepancy is really key. It's really the centerpiece of this model. Okay, what I'm going to do is show a slide that talks about the high levels of meaning violation, and it's way too busy a slide, so just focus on the fact that in this slide, all of the people reported that their beliefs in the world is fair, the beliefs that the world is benevolent, God was in control, or they were in control, and their important goals were all violated. So this is these questions are about how much did the trauma violate, or the bereavement, the trauma, the cancer survivors, how much did it violate your sense that the world is fair, that the world is controllable? Right now, we're developing a measure of violations, and it's pretty much these questions, and then the goals measure, it has a bunch of different goals, and these are averaged. So what this is suggesting is that, yeah, the stuff is perceived, or at least reported, as violating their global meaning. It's not a fabulous way to measure it, but I don't know what another way to measure it is, so we're working on this as a measure. And so again, the point is just that there's a lot of variance in how much people report violation, but it's a pretty strong and consistent finding. And then violations, as I mentioned, are very distressing. People don't like to have their beliefs violated. They don't like to have something happen that's not consistent with what they want, with their goals. This is a structural equation model just showing the beliefs at the top, goals at the bottom, both related independently to PTSD symptoms in our traumatized college student sample. And interestingly, those are mediated by negative beliefs about the world and the self, so that the world is kind of a bad place and I'm a bad person, I'm to blame for what happened to me. This is a trauma participant. I can't believe this happened. Oh, let me just, before I read you her quote. This is a woman who was a student who was thrown down on the ground by a guy who then took her phone, her wallet, some other things, kicked her, and then looked her in the eyes and said thank you as he ran off. And 6 people watched this happen and no one helped her. I can't believe this happened to me. I never would have thought it would happen to me. I was scared. I was shattered. I was terrified of recurrence and couldn't bear to go anywhere alone. I felt like there was nowhere I was safe and nobody who could protect me. That feeling like it could happen at any moment. He didn't even rape me. He didn't even hurt me badly. He just took away the sense of security. He took away my confidence in my ability to protect myself, and he stole away my faith in the people around me. Okay, so you really get a sense of how much violation, how many different beliefs this person had violated in her experience. So the next part, when people are distressed, that motivates them to do something. Okay, so what people try to do when they're distressed is make the distress go away. Lazarus and Folkman talked a lot about the problem-focused and emotion-focused coping that people do. Problem-focused coping is doing things to solve a situation, to resolve a problem. And that's usually the most adaptive way to cope with situations, is to fix them. The emotion-focused coping is what you do to regulate your emotions or sort of tamp those down as you're doing the problem-focused coping. However, trauma is pretty much, by its nature, pretty unsolvable. You can't undo an assault or a rape or a car accident or a combat experience. You have to somehow transform the meaning of it. And the same with bereavement. You can't make a person come back. So those are situations where problem-focused coping, you can solve the problems around that situation, but you can't solve that situation. And so the only thing that we have left to do is to make meaning from it. Meaning making involves 2 things. These are our 2 choices. Assimilate the experience into your pre-existing meaning system by changing how you think about the meaning of the event, or accommodate the event by changing one's global meaning system. And these can be sort of automatic or more effortful, where you're really trying to do them. I mean, they might just happen, or you might really try to make sense of something. And that's really the only choices we got to make those pieces fit back together. You can change your views of a situation, or you can change your global meaning system to accommodate it. These automatic processes, as I mentioned, are typically measured as intrusive thoughts and avoidance and goal shifting. So intrusive thoughts and avoidance, you might be saying, wait a minute, aren't those the symptoms of PTSD? And those are the cardinal symptoms of PTSD. Yes, you would be correct. But they are also considered by a lot of theorists and researchers to be the brain's efforts at healing itself by sort of gradually exposing oneself to this traumatic material and then backing away from it, and then kind of coming towards it and backing away from it in a way that over time allows you to integrate that material into your mind. And unfortunately for a lot of people that doesn't happen, and so they get stuck in this cycle of really distressing, intrusive thoughts, dreams, reminders, and avoiding those things, and that is PTSD. So what's the line between when this is adaptive and helpful for people and when it becomes maladaptive and dysfunctional? Really, I haven't seen anybody delineate when one would be considered no longer helpful and becomes interfering with daily life. But to some extent, that does happen to people, and is efforts to try to integrate that material, and that material remains unintegrated and distressing. Shifting goals is another thing that people do, where when something happens that some event occurs that they can no longer have what it is they really wanted, they may start to think of elements of it that maybe were less desirable, think about alternatives in more positive ways. Not that they're trying to, but that they just start being aware of some of those issues that help them to sort of let go of unattainable goals and shift towards goals that are more reachable. More effortful things like searching for meaning. There's this item that people use in trying to study meaning making that says, how much have you been searching for meaning? It's a good, quick, and if you have room for one item, that's a good measure to use. It's not psychometrically very useful, not very well established as useful. And when you ask people what they mean by searching for meaning, it's really messy because they mean all kinds of different, it's like a whole grab bag of things in there. But at least, it's a little proxy for people who are searching. And this is a study that John Updegraff and his colleagues did after 9/11 in the United States. It was a nationwide sample. They found that almost 70% of people reported searching for meaning. So that concept has some utility for people. Okay, they reported that they were searching for meaning. So that's one way that we might approach trying to understand searching. Another is positive reframing, trying to understand the trauma in a different way, trying to understand it in a more positive way so that it fits into our pre-existing beliefs. Reattributions are trying to find different causal explanations that maybe are more benign or less harmful. One of the things that happens a lot in trauma is people blame themselves, and self-blame tends to be really bad. So trying to find other ways to understand why something happened that are not so much having negative implications for the self. Counterfactuals refers to thinking about what could have been instead of what was. And people will do a lot of counterfactual thinking, saying, it was my cancer was really bad, but at least I didn't have a mastectomy like Susan did. So, in that sense, it wasn't as bad. So you're kind of, again, trying to make it less aversive, less bad. Social comparisons, again, looking at what happens to other people. and kind of comparing yourself and saying, you know, my situation's not so bad. The problem with, I put reframing, positive reframing and reframing, because a lot of the reframing that people end up doing may not be so positive. But if you're trying to fit something into your pre-existing worldview, it may be not such a, maybe you realize that if you believe that you have control over your life and you did this really stupid thing that resulted in an accident, then you would say, I am at fault there, but that will help to restore global meaning. So positive reframing is not always positive, but the end goal is to fit it back into your worldviews, into your global meaning. And religious or spiritual coping, that's a different talk, as I said. I'm not here to really go into the psyche of religion and spirituality too much, but you really can't talk about people dealing with trauma, bereavement, really horrible life events without hearing a lot of discussion of religion and spirituality. It is, trauma by its nature cuts to the core of who we are. When you're faced with the really profound, really horrific events, it really brings up a lot of religious and spiritual issues. You hear a lot of spiritual struggle. That was, Bob talked a lot about that yesterday, about how bereavement often, particularly in those violent bereavements, brings up a lot of spiritual issues where people are asking a lot of questions about why and how and now what that really do involve their religious or their spiritual issues. So people use religious or spiritual coping in terms of trying to make something less aversive, saying, maybe God's trying to teach me something here, maybe this wasn't all bad, maybe this is for the good. Maybe it's to help me be a better Christian. Maybe it's to help me to be more compassionate to others. So you hear a lot of religious or spiritual coping. The truth is, though, that try as you might, most trauma is beyond just reframing or looking at in more positive ways. That it's just truly horrendous and just not going to be what you wanted to have happen, and not going to be consistent with how you understood the world to work. And so a lot of people do meaning making that starts to really start shifting those global meanings as well. So here are some examples of the meaning making in our participants. I've been thinking more about what happened because of this writing. So they're doing the intervention. Once my sister's out of the house, I want to confront my father and tell him everything that happened in the house when we were younger, but I'm scared. Is it the right thing to do? Am I being selfish by trying to clear my mind about what happened? Should I let the past, as they say, stay in the past? I don't know. I do know I think he has the right, and he deserves to know. I want to, in my deepest thoughts, see what he will do. Why did God let Steve drive that night when he knew he was going to die? And many people might say, well, God gave us free will, but how can that be true if God knows everything? My deepest thoughts about this experience are all things that people can't answer. I have questions like, why me, and why did he do it, rolling around in my mind, but cannot answer them. All I know is that this event has led me to become better educated about assault and how to protect myself, and now I'll be ready for when the next time comes along. So this person's already expecting more assault. So kind of get that sense that there are these shifts in people's global meaning, that they're really struggling, really working towards some different understanding. So those changes, those shifts are called meanings made in this model, at least. And one of the things that I worked really hard on in the review paper I showed you the reference for is try to understand the difference between meaning making, which is a process, is a verb, it's a thing people are doing, and meaning made, which is a noun, which is an outcome of a process. Okay, so meaning making is that active processing, thinking, trying to fit the pieces together, trying to understand it differently, and those outcomes are meanings made. Okay, so meanings made will reduce discrepancy, and ideally they'll facilitate adjustment, although as I mentioned, sometimes people will come up with some pretty negative ways of understanding their situation or making these changes in their global meaning system that may not be so positive. So in that earlier study I talked about, John Updegraff's study after 9/11, they have a second question. So in addition to saying searching for meaning, they have finding meaning. Again, it's a pretty lousy item, but in a nationwide survey, they got those 2 items in there. And so they looked at finding meaning as an outcome. And at that point, most of the people said, 2 months later that they really hadn't found meaning at all. But the problem, again, just like with searching for meaning, is that item, have you found meaning? People will answer, but then you say, what did you mean by finding meaning? And it's all over the place. So, so there's some other ways that we look at meanings made or these outcomes of the process. Really changing the view of the situation. People might have a different view of that situation or its implications for their life over time that have helped to, so especially in the implications, because a lot of times when people are encountering something really traumatic, they feel like they'll never be the same, they'll never be able to go on, this has ruined them, it's ruined their life. And over time, you can change those kinds of beliefs and say that maybe it's more manageable and that maybe in some ways it was a good thing it happened because, so in some ways you can change that situational meaning. But as I said, because trauma is so profoundly shakes people up and it gets at such a core of their existence, a lot of times this is not enough, just changing your view and saying, oh, well, it was a really unfortunate experience, but I'm ready to move on. It's not that easy, okay, because the stuff is just too deep. And so a lot of times you do see other changes more in terms of global meaning. Here are a couple examples of primarily situational meaning change that people reported. At first, when it happened, I had trouble talking about it because I had felt as if it were my fault, but with reassurance and eventually being able to talk about the experience, I was able to find in myself that this wasn't my fault at all, and I didn't deserve this. The only thing that will remain immortal against time is the memories, stories, photos, and legacy will be passed down from generation to generation. I feel that because of this newfound idea, he never really left us. Lately, thinking about him, I wish he could have seen me grow up into being the person that I am today, how much I have achieved and accomplished. He would have been so proud of me. So that second one, the bereavement one, to shift into saying, well, there is this sense that he's still present, that there's still this bond. So that kind of doesn't take away totally the loss of, I think this was his grandfather, but at least it mitigates it and says, it really changes the view of he's totally gone to there is this linkage, there is this connection that remains. And so that does change the meaning of that loss. But more likely, you're going to see changes in global meaning after trauma, because as I said, it's not something that's easily reframed and taken away. And these are some examples of changed global beliefs. I used to think that nothing bad would happen to me. Now I know that I'm not exempt from bad experiences, so my optimism is gone. My belief in God has been confirmed. I feel great comfort in knowing I have this to turn to. I have a greater appreciation for life. What I need is to change my weight. Okay, so that person, in terms of changes in global beliefs, the first person is less optimistic and has this sense that bad things can happen. They can just drop out of the sky at any minute. And that is, some people would call that being sadder but wiser. The more realistic view of how much you can control and predict things and how uncontrollable and unpredictable the world is. She's had a shift there. The second person, has a more perhaps positive global belief change, but they're both outcomes. Identity reconstruction is another place where you see people having shifted their global beliefs. These are a couple cancer participants, survivors. I reclaimed my life. I realized I was depressed because I'd given myself away in relationships. I started doing the things that make me happy, working to be more assertive in relationships, laughing more, looking at the future. my growing relationships within my adult children and my grandson. Mostly I realized how strong and resilient I am. So much of my fear and self-consciousness is gone. I am very comfortable being exactly who I am now. The biggest change, I'm applying to graduate school to do work that truly reflects who I am. So these are shifts in identity that people are taking that experience and changing aspects of their global meaning. And change global goals is another aspect of change global meaning. These are more cancer survivor participants. The most significant thing I do is provide proactive encouragement to newly diagnosed cancer patients that are referred to me through friends. I assist with references on wigs, foods that work under chemo, and continuous exercise throughout treatments. I speak about cancer because I want others to know that the human spirit can help overcome challenges. I also contribute more to help find cures, and my attitude toward my work as far as letting it infringe on any family time. I do the best job I can, but now do not take work away from my family time. So those first two are people who are finding sort of a new meaning, a new goal of helping other cancer survivors, or other people, other cancer patients, people newly diagnosed or going through treatment. You see that a lot in a lot of illness, health populations, but my experience, particularly with cancer survivors, is it's really pretty amazing to see how when they kind of get through their own experience, they're reaching out and trying to help others and finding a great deal of meaning. That becomes a really important goal for them. And the last person is just putting limits on work and saying, you know, family is a priority. I'm going to make sure that I keep that in mind. So again, sort of an outcome of that process of trying to figure out how to understand their experience. I thought this person was pretty good at describing what a resolution of trauma might look like. As I look back on everything that has happened in my life, the pain is not as strong anymore. I've been able to cope with it. Therefore, the pain has subsided, and even though the scars will still be there, I think it's a way to remember what happened to you, but that you were able to surpass it and keep living. It is necessary to pass through those types of experiences because it is the only way we can learn to better handle them. So that's kind of what you've got when you've got trauma. It happened, and you're not going to say that it didn't, but you can kind of find better ways to deal with it. And that leads to, and you can hear hints of this in this person's narrative, is this issue of stress-related growth. Stress-related growth is a topic that a lot of people who study trauma are very interested in now. There's been a lot of studies on this topic lately. It's also called perceived benefits, post-traumatic growth, or adversarial growth. And there's just been, I mean, if you type this in a literature search, you just come up with literally hundreds of studies. About half of them seem to be done in the cancer survivorship populations, and then the other half in just about any trauma, you know, from car accidents or ship accidents to natural disasters to 9/11. I mean, people have looked at this growth, this perceived growth in all sorts of places. It's typically thought of as an outcome of the process of meaning making, but it can also be understood as people's efforts to cope with and try to make meaning out of something that they're still distressed about. And it's not phrased that way. I mean, the questions are, as a result of my trauma, I appreciate life more. And so somebody might be accurately reporting or think they're accurately reporting that they do, but they may be trying to still to process what happened to them. And so it's a little bit tough to interpret what this measure means. But it involves identifying or creating these positive aspects and can be a potentially adaptive way to make meaning. And these are the domains that people talk about stress-related growth in. Personal relationships have improved, coping skills are better, life philosophies, spiritual development, wisdom, maturity, compassion for others through the suffering that one has experienced, and lifestyle changes. You hear that a lot when people have a heart attack or cancer and come out the other side and say, you know, I've really tried to change, use that as a wake-up call. And this participant, cancer survivor, I have learned to appreciate and really notice and not take for granted what my family and close friends do for me. It became more realistic to me that people can get sick at any moment. Therefore, you need to appreciate the time you have right now. As a result of surviving this experience, I have become more careful about what I choose to let really affect me. I try not to get upset or mad about little things that I know do not really matter. In my mind now, it is no longer worth it because much more serious things can happen. I realize that people must go through hard times in order to really appreciate the good ones and to appreciate what you have. So I have some other cancer survivor quotes as well. I'm more outspoken about issues and things affecting me. I now find myself saying if I don't want to do something, I won't. I'm also volunteering with the American Cancer Society, work with other women facing breast cancer. I'm more able to put stress in its proper light. I am stronger and more determined than I ever knew I could be. I try to lead a healthy lifestyle. So you hear a lot of this kind of growth of people's reports of positive changes that they've experienced on the other side of a cancer survivor, of a cancer experience. So this process of trying to, make sense, of trying to understand is an ongoing process. And so this this part right here can go on, until the person no longer experiences discrepancy and achieves that resolution. So this could be quick. This could take a very long time. So there are a lot of basic research questions. If you're a researcher, you're looking for a good topic of something to study. What's the time course under which meaning-making processes unfold? How these processes influenced by social and cultural contexts? Are some types of global meaning relatively impervious to violation? Do others leave individuals particularly vulnerable in the event of a traumatic event? And I think that's really important to try to understand. People who have these more flexible worldviews or these more flexible ways of understanding that can be, fairly positive but can absorb, have a little shock absorption, are going to be more helpful when people encounter adversity or trauma than people who've got these very rigid kinds of belief systems. Which global and situational changes in meaning are lasting, which are temporary, and why. And one of the things about the stress-related growth, it's great to sort of track these people over time and see if some of those changes, because we all have a tendency to sort of return to our baseline. So how much of those changes are real and stick, and how much of them just sort of revert back to how people were before. What kinds of meaning-related processes are triggered with subsequent trauma? As we know from the literature, people who've experienced one trauma, even if they've recovered from it, are going to be more vulnerable to more PTSD symptomatology when they encounter more adversity. So, what are those processes in multiple traumas? And can we enhance resilience by strengthening adaptive global meaning resources in advance? So, a lot of really important questions. This stuff is so hard to study because it's all self-report. I mean, I don't know how you could do this with anything else. You're not going to look at people's genes. You're not going to stick them in a scanner and see meaning making going on really in any meaningful way. So how you really get to these things, especially because they're occurring over time, and if you ask people keep a diary or do these kinds of things, then you're intervening, okay? Because then they're paying attention and they're writing it down, and that becomes an intervention. So it's really very challenging to understand these processes. People over a long period of time. And ideally, you'd want to be really close to that event, the proximal trauma that you're going to track. And when people were in the midst of a trauma or bereavement, they're really not that excited about participating in a research study. People do manage to recruit amazing samples, but it's very challenging to do that. Okay, so those are some of the research questions. I would like to really quickly talk about, and really quickly, healing from PTSD, because I know that people are also interested in applications, and Paul this morning said, so what? Why is this important? What do we do with it? There are many ways that the meaning-making model is very relevant to clinical work following trauma, and I'm working with some colleagues, Jean Slattery, Joe Currier, and Irene Harris on a book on spirituality and meaning in the context of trauma. And we have this model that we're talking about where there are 3 phases: promoting safety, processing traumatic memories and situational meanings, and restoring relationships and global meaning. And that first phase, promoting safety, is really just getting people stable, making sure that they're safe, out of harm's way in terms of violent situations, substance abuse, etc. And Najavitz is probably the person best known for this sort of pre-processing stability stage, getting people to a place where they're going to be comfortable. The processing traumatic memories and situational meanings. This involves habituation and exposure and reappraisal. So people are kind of deconditioning their fear responses, having corrective emotional experiences in the context of a therapist in a safe place. And in doing so, they develop a sense of mastery, that in control, that they can talk and that it's not overwhelming. It doesn't mean their demise to be able to talk about it. And enhancing their narrative organization so that they have a better way of understanding. And so you're getting into the reappraisal processes, the cognitive reappraisal. Right now, there are two major therapies that are cognitive behavioral therapies that are used in dealing with trauma. One is Patty Rezick's cognitive processing therapy, and in the United States, this is used at all the VAs in the country. It's a very popular, empirically based therapy where people write an account of their trauma, they read it in the therapy, they read it at home, they work on other ways, other exercises to do this cognitive restructuring and emotional processing. They deal with these major issues, or what she calls stuck points: safety, trust, power, control, esteem, and intimacy. So you see a lot of parallels with the global meaning that I've been talking about. A lack of assimilation, meaning that that event is just, so discrepant it's not integrated. And she also talks about over-accommodation, meaning sometimes people change their global meaning too much. So, maybe the person who assaulted you was a dangerous man, but not all men are dangerous. So that kind of over-accommodation needs to be worked on as well. And then prolonged exposure by Edna Foa, that's the other big cognitive behavioral therapy. And in this one, and I won't go into all the details, but she also has a lot of sort of re-exposure with, again, feeling a sense of control, feeling a sense of mastery there. And reappraising and coming to see that your trauma doesn't need to activate your whole fear network, again, assigning different meanings to that situation. Now, one of the things that both of these therapies do very well is that processing of the immediate trauma. But one of the things that meaning-making therapies might also do, and probably should emphasize more than they do currently, is also restoring global meaning and relationships. And so there's that whole, once you've processed the trauma and you've got some kind of recovery, to restore more adaptive global meanings and relationships, because relationships tend to get disturbed in the process of dealing with traumatic situations. So in conclusion, I just want to say, I have 2 minutes. I just want to say I am very heartened by the increased attention that these meaning processes are receiving in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different ways. And the energy, the enthusiasm that people at a conference like this bring to these issues, I think is a good indicator of the health and growth of this field. And so that, I think, is very exciting from a research angle and from an application standpoint. And one of the things I think is most exciting is if we can find ways to not only treat people who've already been traumatized, but maybe to find resources to make people more resilient. So maybe some of the beliefs and maybe some of the practices that people have pre-trauma, assuming that they may encounter adversity or stress, might be helpful to them. And one of the things that was really exciting to me was seeing a couple posters out in the lobby on yoga. So I think that that is Samantha and Nicole both have posters out there on yoga. And so spiritual practices like that may be ways that people can be sort of inoculated or prepared so that, God forbid, something horrific happens to them, they have the resources, they have some beliefs and practices in place that may at least mitigate the impact of the trauma. So just a final quote from a participant, because I love undergraduates and they They say some amazing things. You leave life with two things, money and memories. You can't spend money in heaven, so I'm going to use up my money all up and make as many memories as possible. So, thank you.
Dr. Clark, I want to thank you for your support for INPM since 2000 and your contribution to our publications.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
we wish we could sit here and study for 2 days. Wouldn't that be nice? Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I have 2 announcements. And number 1, when you registered for this conference, tomorrow night's banquet is included. And if you're not, you are